Susie Hess.
And I'm Yehuda Price. This is Our Stories Matter.
So we are super excited to have Naima Ramos-Chapman here today, who was connected to Claudia Pena, who is a mutual friend of both of ours. So I'm really excited to have you here today, Naima. So I'm going to read your bio first. Well, not even your bio. It's like a quarter of it, which is incredibly beautiful. So Naima Ramos-Chapman works to tell stories of transformation and understated bravery by rendering the juxtaposition of psycho-spiritual realities we cannot see alongside the normalized brutalities hiding in everyday life. Naima is currently in the metaphorical woods developing several projects in the docu-narrative hybrid space that center BIPOC femmes taking back their power after surviving hierarchical abuses internalized by the dominant social order of white supremacy and toxic masculinity. Welcome. We're really excited to have you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I love the work that you both do. And I feel like a lot of it is challenging. And I'm interested in just, how the conversation is going to go. And yeah, happy to be here. So thank you.
Yes. So can you start off and just tell us your why for doing this work?
Sure. The reason why I make films, and most of my films tend to be autobiographical by nature. I try my independent work because, I do stuff for commercial, but also in the indie, more art space. And in the indie art space, my intention is to sort of, try to break cycles of trauma that I'm observing is present in my own life, or that I feel like is tethered to an ancestral lineage of sorts. And I do that, selfishly because I'm just always considering how to observe and maybe learn to love what society sometimes dictates or tells us to hate, or to just be curious about, those internalized voices that I think we all hear sometimes in our head or feel in our bodies, that is residue from trauma, and trauma that happens at a very young age, but also can sometimes, because you're exposed to trauma early on, subconsciously you might be more open to other exposures of trauma, at least in my experience, that has been my experience. I made my first short film called And Nothing Happened. And it was centered around the brutality, the aftermath of the brutality of rape, and most specifically about when I was assaulted sexually in Washington, D.C. About 6 or 7 years ago. I can't actually remember exactly when, but the film I made in 2015, and it got into the Slamdance Film Festival in 2016. And it was right before the Me Too movement and kind of gained in popularity, I think, just because a lot of women were sort of considering what it's like to let go of shame and maybe not hold on to the stigmatization that I think we all have to sort of deal with when we've been assaulted and not quite understanding, the reasons why, and there is really no reason why. And so, I kind of make the work to sort of ask myself questions about how trauma affects you, and how can we also talk about these stories without perhaps re-traumatizing ourselves or other people, but continue to be honest and have an honest conversation about how, one, it's not uniquely. It's not so unique to one person's experience, but because we're all holding it sometimes alone and we're not sharing it in group, or maybe we don't have access to group therapy, that it can feel like you're alone. So I think, making films, because of how quickly film travels and how it can last in perpetuity, in a sense, I think, I definitely tell stories so that other people feel emboldened to share theirs, whether that's like right after the film or by making, art, poetry, or film on their own to kind of talk specifically about their own experience and understand that they are the experts of their experience. So that's the long-winded version of why I tell stories of understated bravery, because I feel like, we are all of us are our own saviors, of a sense. And it's also, I'm learning, okay to also ask for help and support in that. So that's sort of why I started making films, and that's it.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate what you said about, not wanting to re-traumatize, because actually the entire podcast is focused on the healing piece, not to have, trauma porn and not to re-traumatize folks. But what are some healing modalities that folks can incorporate or practice from these traumas? So I so appreciate how you said that, because I think it's super important. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the very same notion that Susie was speaking about. I think a lot of people don't want to examine trauma because it makes them so uncomfortable or it re-traumatizes them. And so it's kind of, if you're not addressing it in some particular manner and you've found a way to do that, it kind of is left unresolved, and it could fester and affect you in ways that you don't necessarily realize. And then it could be transferred intergenerationally, as a lot of BIPOC people, as some of your work centers on, know very well, just from our own intergenerational experiences, or that coming from our particular ancestors. So you mentioning that really resonated with me. And so I'm wondering, to follow up on that, how has your work been healing for you? I know you gave some of your own personal disclosures, so I'm kind of wondering, like, for your own personal experience, how has it been healing for you?
How has my work been healing for me? Well, I think it has been, but I actually don't know. I feel like one thing my first short film allowed me to do was to kind of take back control over the narrative of what happened, just simply because I had gone through litigation and tried to do all the quote unquote right things that my mom told me one should do if they're ever raped. And I found it to be a very disappointing process, simply because, when I called police and reported and showed up to all of the different parts of the procedure, I found that unfortunately, it wasn't quote unquote enough evidence that people saw the perpetrator. It wasn't enough. There was just sort of a sense of, like, I would not find a sense of justice going through this channel. And so much of it requires the survivor to continue to tell their story, and then for people to challenge their perspective. And I just remember certain questions about, like, what I was wearing that felt like very shame-inducing, for instance. And while, yes, I'm sure people were just trying to do their job, I think the tone, or kind of just feeling re-victimized by the bureaucratic process, kind of left me feeling like I needed another way to quote unquote report what happened that isn't necessarily like a court-ordered document or somebody else externally validating my experience. And so, with making the film, I've been able to express what I believe happened and what I know happened, whether or not, like, it ever saw the light of day in a court, and whether or not the person who raped me has to face any consequences. And, I remember this one thing the detective told me when we were having this conversation, because he said that they weren't able to prosecute. He was like, well, at least you did report it and it's on record. He'll probably do it again. And so at least, and I was just like, that's the whole point. Like, we don't want this to happen again. But long story short, I think for me, making films about my experience just allows for my own record, to be expressed, but through art making, through this sort of these skills and talents I've acquired through, like, my own journey, as a dancer. I started dancing when I was 3 years old. And as a performer, I've taken, a few I've been acting for a while now, and I've also, had some experience as a journalist, and was always obsessed with telling stories through different mediums. And so with filmmaking, I'm able to draw on all of those experiences and create something that feels very unique to how I see the world and how I understand it's not only about what you can read in a newspaper or what the news tells you, but it's also about, how you're seeing and feeling the world, which is very, very, very subjective, and that matters too. And so I think for anyone who has survived trauma, I think it's super important to find spaces that allow that are safe or brave, that allow for one to be in ownership of telling that story, and also over time being okay with that story changing as well as we, move through what has happened to us. So
yeah, you make some salient points, and I have found that too. I've interviewed a lot of people who've dealt with the justice process of trying to, find justice from, through what happened, and it's a lot of times it's unsatisfying to say the very least. We talk about also re-traumatizing. Depersonalizes it and makes it this bureaucratic process, as you mentioned. And then at the end result, who wants to hear that? Okay, well, at least we have it on record, and next time we have more ammunition, right? Because you're trying to actually prevent it. And, when one is trying to seek justice and get meaning out of what happened or whatnot, to have that be the end result, right? So yeah, there's a whole bunch of different things I imagine that was going through your mind through this process, but I appreciate the fact that you found this medium through film to kind of address that to a certain extent, at least, and deal with that. And so I'm wondering, in general, I know how you spoke about it for yourself, but I know telling these other stories, and you probably have a different sort of insight of doing it from the person who's filming it. So I'm wondering, what does it mean to address trauma through film?
What does it mean? I'm asking myself that question as well. Currently, because, I've made a few things since and nothing happened. Like most recently, I had a short film called In Place of Monuments, premiered at Black Star Film Fest the other day, and working on a documentary called Our Inheritance. And it's sort of about trying to piece together the narrative and apply meaning to what I feel like has been passed down through my family by collecting stories from both my mom and dad, and also trying to do research on both of them. They were both civil rights activists. My father actually survived 15 years in prison after being sentenced to 250, figured out enough about his case to write about it. And then Angela Davis heard of him, and through working with her and a few other prison abolitionists, he's devoted his life to activism. And neither one of them are filmmakers. They're both community organizers. My mom, she does more very, very direct neighborhood organizing. And she's super badass too. She used to be a bodyguard for Angela Davis. Both of them are activists. I call myself an artist just because I don't organize around policy changing, not anymore anyway. And so I think I center trauma partially because I think organizing for policy change sometimes feels very goal-oriented, whereas, trauma is something we still, I feel like as a society, struggle to really accept as something that we need to see and be about. And just trauma through film, I feel like, I still am trying to figure out what it means to address it through film. I think, because of the way images work, brains, and how we're asked to suspend disbelief when watching a film, I think, it offers a creative for the, what that director behind, how they're seeing or understanding trauma. And so the gaze definitely matters. And so if you're looking at, or if you're telling a story through the eyes of a survivor, I think that looks very different from someone who has not experienced that abuse or that trauma. But also, I think it just depends on that person's perspective of it and what story they've told themselves about what happened. So, I mean, it's a challenging question to answer because I think it's something I haven't answered yet for myself. I tell stories about trauma. And I think what I'm always trying to do is that if I do go to that place, is there somewhere at the end where I can offer some stoic optimism about a healing that I can't dictate, but at least the viewer can ask of themselves. So, yeah, I feel like a lot of films, they want to have a bow tie at the end. They want to like have a very clear, fixed message about what it means to be healed. But because healing is an ongoing process, I think, films that allow one to understand that it's like up to them, I think fare better than those that kind of dictate this is how you should feel once this happens. Yeah. So that's a really long answer. But
yeah, I mean, you obviously have incredibly powerful family of, the work that they were doing. And it's interesting because Yehuda and I, as we're interviewing folks, most of them we know were system impacted or were formerly incarcerated. And then the folks that we didn't know were. So then that leads to obviously the connection to the United States, right? In terms of, and Angela Davis says this, that prison is contemporary slavery. So my question for you is, you've talked about, your dad being inside, rape. Obviously, this is super common in terms of sexual assault in the United States as well. What are your thoughts about healing from the United States? What does that look like?
Also a very hard question to answer. But I can at least tell you what I'm thinking, because I don't know what it's like to live anywhere else but the United States. So in terms of healing from, what I'm learning through, talking to my parents, getting their stories and how it's also connected to my story. And then, my own experience here, living in Brooklyn, New York, and making work here about that experience, but also understanding that like no one lives in a vacuum. That I don't know. Like, I honestly feel like, my family, we're survivors of so much systematic oppression and repression, political repression, that, I really am thankful for the ways that they have allowed me access to education, but an education that I had to like audition for, which I think is interesting. I grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and, my mom did most of the raising. I was raised by mostly women, and I understood really quickly, because she was very honest with me about the why. I never got confused with thinking that it was because of something I had done, not on a conscious level, to be here, to be on welfare. Or I kind of understood that even though my dad, sure, maybe wasn't around to raise me, that he did do his best to come back and forth, and was also sort of trying to understand and deal with his own trauma, and I think that's the challenging part, is that like we have like really wild expectations of individuals, this like American dream or this American myth of rugged individualism, which is such a farce, which is such a lie. But we all have been programmed to believe it. And so even I struggle sometimes to not internalize that sexism is not my fault, or when someone's being racist, that's not my fault, or, there's only so much we can do. And for me, I think healing looks like, sharing your stories and understanding that you're not alone. But I think there's an extra step that I'm actually trying to figure out for myself, because I think my films are very centered around my own experience, because that's all I feel very comfortable talking about and kind of messing with. I have made films though, like I made a short virtual reality film called Still Here that was in the New Frontier section of Sundance in 2020 that it was fiction, but based on a lot of interviews that I conducted alongside Al Jazeera with the Women's Prison Association. And so kind of understanding, that these are all stories that that so many people have. And so, prison, mass incarceration definitely is contemporary slavery. It's a permutation of slavery. And I think, maybe I'm not so sure if we're there yet where we have dismantled that or we're even close to abolishing it. But at the very least, we can continue to put pressure by acknowledging that, like, we didn't do anything to belong there. That's a constant struggle. So I'm so concerned with the psychic constant struggle. Whereas I think, activists are more concerned with the materiality, and I think they kind of work hand in hand. So, I don't really know how you heal from the United States. I feel like we're all trying to figure it out. And for me, I just know what I've survived, but there's so many other things that I feel like I'm just learning about my own experience and how, like, my mom's experience and my dad's and people before them, how that all has affected where we are now. And so I try to really divest from the mythology of rugged individualism and try not to pathologize myself or my community for stuff that's not wrong with us. There's like, and try to be proud and accepting of where we're at and rendering that in the way that that feels good and feels challenging and feels subversive. At least I try, Sometimes one fails, but I think we can all try.
Thank you. Yeah, like something just to add, you're so aligned with, I was reading an article from Adrienne Marr Brown this morning, and she was talking about the importance to imagine a different future. And just to have that imagination, then we have a goal. So in terms of, abolition and what would that look like? Just imagining what that could potentially be, because the white supremacists imagine what is happening today, right? And they imagined what was going to happen in history, whether it's, political or economical. So I resonated with her words of just imagine what this could potentially look like. And I think that with COVID, right, that we're still in terms of who did it impact. So yeah, I so appreciate all of your words.
Kind of following up what Susie says and what you said, and I see it to a certain extent. So I kind of want you to kind of go more into that. Is how do you see community healing as political?
We would like to, I feel like artists always get into this trap because we would like to think what we're doing is never political, but it always is. And community healing, it's definitely political. I think when you start to understand the ways in which you can love one another, I hope this doesn't sound corny, but I feel like what I'm learning with community is sort of really understanding any sort of the discomfort I feel or the fear or the reactivity is definitely a trauma response, and it's a trauma response from the stories I think, America has told me, even though I'm resisting those stories about people like my father, or people like my mother, or people like myself. I think it's sort of by truly accepting where I'm at, my family's at, and my community, and not holding on to these sort of fantasies that are born from the white imagination about what it means to be a quote unquote nuclear whole family or surrendering to a respectability politic in order to get ahead, for instance. I think we can imagine something else, something that connects where we are to at present to a future, and a future that kind of, and this is where the work is. So we're really trying to figure out, all right, am I really divesting from these tropes of white supremacy? And I find it's really hard, and you can't really do it quickly. You need to take the time to do it. So yeah, I think community healing is absolutely a political act, because I think as soon as, and you realize it because as soon as it starts to like happen, expand and grow, like with the Black Lives Matter movement, and at like its height, there was definitely, an embrace and acceptance, but also America was very, very much like, yeah, but slow down. Like we need to definitely figure this out. But like, you can see it in the language where first we were talking about abolishing prisons, and now it's sort of become about reform and something else, or training police to be quote unquote better, as if it's an individual like bad apple problem. So, I mean, it's like the work is both demanding and asking these systems for change, and also, having a home or a place to rest. And so I think community healing is about that. Like, we continue to take care of ourselves through, meeting up and sharing meals, through, being activated and standing up for each other when it comes to these rents and how impossible they are to pay right now during a pandemic, or really just like understanding that we are in an unprecedented time, and people are being asked to work nonstop and for very little pay, and like that these are not great times, and really acknowledging that and maybe having compassion. But honestly, community healing and being proud of where you come from, being proud. I'm very proud that I'm Black and Puerto Rican. I am very accepting that, my family and we were poor, and right now we're doing all right. and understanding that can also go at any moment, because we don't have the financial security that wealth provides, and that's not our fault. And so it's sort of like building from there. And I think that is where the community healing is about. It's knowing how to build without antagonizing and pathologizing each other for what is somewhat out of our control. Because white supremacy and sexism and patriarchy are up to white men to divest from, more so than should it be on the shoulders of Black queer women or femmes or non-binary people. So yeah.
Well, you said a whole bunch of powerful stuff. I see Susie wants something to say, but I'm sure that there's a lot of things that I'm going to be wrapping my mind around, kind of, meditating on it, what it means, especially coming from your particular perspective. So thank you for sharing that with me. I'll let Susie jump in right here.
Yeah, what you were saying was super powerful, because I also think, hope dismantles, right? And if we can keep hope alive, and if we can have an imagination to what could be, I think those are the beginning steps, right, of dismantling masculine toxicity and white supremacy. And just what you said, you gave so much hope. You gave hope in terms of what you've experienced, what your family's experienced, and that you're still rising up. And I feel like, hope is inspirational. So I appreciate what you said.
Speaking to what you said, talking about these structures and these systems that's in place, I'm wondering, what does it look like to you? What does radical liberation look like through film?
So radical liberation through film, well, I feel only radical liberation through film. I'm kind of experimenting and trying to figure that out myself. I work with so many different teams and have had my foot in a few different pools of filmmaking. And I will say independent filmmaking is definitely my favorite, because I think it's the realm where I do feel most liberated and able to do my thing. And really also where people feel comfortable challenging my thinking or certain habits. I think we forget that filmmaking is definitely born out of a very hierarchical, militant style of leadership. It's not horizontal. There's a director, he quote unquote shoots an actor, and everyone's supposed to listen to that person. And, we have these concepts of what leadership looks like, and it's usually a white man. And so I think radical liberation through film sort of looks like really interrogating how we make the film, in addition to the why we make a film, in addition to, the gaze behind the film, in addition to, is the director being honest about their interest in the material? Are they being as vulnerable as the subjects that they're interviewing? And I think that is why I make autobiographical work, because it feels like I put a lot on the line. And for instance, right now I'm working on another documentary I read about, that's sort of asking these questions about how we can even think about distributing a grant. There's $10K for a short piece of this documentary. And what is it like to make sure that everyone who works on it gets paid, but we might not have as much equipment? It might not be the most quote unquote cinematic thing, because we decided that like the people who were interviewing for a documentary actually get paid, as opposed to being like, this is journalistic work and they should just tell stories for free. And understanding the power dynamic in that, and like what I have and what they have, especially if the person I'm talking to is a survivor of abuse or is in between homes, or that their time is valuable as well, and that there is some sort of emotional labor at play when they're deciding to bear all and share and trust for you to make a film that you may profit the most from. So, we're shooting this film in Miami, and it centers sex workers who are talking about their stories, but we really try not to film in strip clubs. If there's any movement or dancing, it's something that they're choreographing or we're workshopping together. We are not really interested in talking to any Johns, for instance, and also we're okay with people having very different perspectives about the quote unquote industry, so, and it's continuing to evolve and challenges me as well. And I think on the last shoot, for instance, there was a moment where, I'm interested in someone taking the camera away from me. And what is it like for them to hold the camera and decide where it's shooting, and if they want to shoot at my face, great. Or at the grass, great. And like, what are the questions that are going to come up for them? And so it's more conversational. And even though, yes, it's definitely like my vision of radical liberation, it's still, I think, the invites a certain level of quote unquote chaos or spontaneity to happen, and for me to be outnumbered by that, and for me to also examine the ways that I might emulate masculinity or patriarchy, or classism is a big thing as well. And so it's a very slow, long, and process, and one of those things that I'm enjoying, but it's definitely radical in approach, and therefore it's hard for other people to sometimes grasp what it is, and to honestly like hand over money in terms of grants for it. But we've been fortunate and are continuing to develop the film. And so I feel like that is an example of what radical liberation through filmmaking can be. It's sort of just really asking the questions of finding a method or process of how to experiment with that beyond just what does the film look like, but how you're making it as well.
Thank you. I mean, I'm super intrigued now to kind of follow up and look into more of the stuff that you're doing. So I'll ask this next question with me in mind as well. So I want to know what action steps can listeners begin to take if they would like to get involved with activism through film?
Well, again, I do not consider myself an activist, though I really appreciate that some of my work resonates with those who would identify as activists and who do that really, really hard labor and organizing that like I, can wrap my head around because, my mom and dad do it, but I decidedly made a different path forward to consider the same values. But in terms of picking up a film, like camera, I think, it can be a radical act. It can be activist in a way to just pick up your phone and like film something that needs to be seen. I really appreciate that. So Darnella Frazier, who recorded the death of George Floyd, she's been honored with a few awards. And I feel like that, to me, I really appreciate us acknowledging that that was film activism. What she did is film activism. What I'm doing. I'm doing something different, and I'm an artist, but, sometimes there's some intersectionality, and also filming the aftermath in a poetic way could be considered film activism. So I feel like there's all of these ways one is called to it. It could be very immediate, where you just understand that something is really off and requires an accounting, requires a witness, and you're present and you're there and you're deciding to document it and share it with the world in an instant, like Darnella Frazier. And come what may. And, I'm really in awe and inspired by Miss Frazier and like film activists who take on that role. And I think some of us who decide that they're curious about maybe just pointing the camera in the direction of what they value and understanding the aesthetics and the rendering of what they value, and understanding if you're a Black, queer, femme, non-binary person, that instantly is going to be very different from what mainstream society has decided is important to value. I think that can be a radical act. Not always. I think it depends on the intentionality behind it. But yeah, I think for those who are interested in getting into it, I think you just use what's most available, work with people that you know, and also ask those who have more experience or whose work you're interested in terms of how they came to it. But we all come to it in different ways, and then our paths are very nonlinear. So yeah, I think if you're interested, just start with one story. Yeah.
I appreciate that. And a lot of the intention of our Stories Matter podcast is to dismantle false narratives and really to bring the stories of truth to the forefront. And we have seen, it's always been the case in this country, but we've seen on social media just in the past 4 years, especially, right, of the false narrative. And what I think you're doing, which I so appreciate just reading on your website, which we'll post and share with everyone, your work really, I think, liberates the person who maybe is afraid to come forward, and that I'm not the only one. And you don't have to do this in isolation. I have done nonviolent protests, and one nonviolent act through film that I love, that I learned, is an app called Mobile Justice. That if you see an injustice on the streets, you film it and it goes directly to the ACLU. Mm-hmm. So I have my finger on that just when I leave my place, like all the time. So I just feel like you really empower and liberate so many of us, to be honest, who suffer in silence and who may not think that it has happened to others. And, you are super brave. You didn't know us, and just talking about your lived experience and your passion through film and what that means to be an artist within social justice. So I'm curious, what has it been like for you to tell your story today?
Oh, yeah. I'm really thankful for just being able to talk through a few things that I don't quite have like concrete answers about. And so I really appreciate the space to sort of just exist in that unknowing. It's making me consider a few different pathways and possibilities for myself. I feel like my story is always really rapidly changing, and sometimes my head can't sit still. And I think especially when talking about, the interesting thing about films is that when you filmed it, you felt a certain way. And then all these years pass and it still has a certain like hold on someone or people can watch it and whatever they're taking from it, you're so removed. It's a memory, but it exists and it's like somewhat not a part of you anymore. And so I feel like sometimes telling my own story feels a little, I don't know. I think it feels strange, to be honest. But I really am thankful for the opportunity to sort of just talk about, some of the work that I'm interested in and being able to actually talk about it makes me appreciate it even more and motivates me to continue, because sometimes it gets really, really hard when people don't quite understand, or, it doesn't pay well, or, you have to figure out where you're going to get the money from, or who's going to understand and think that this story matters but me. And then you realize, the more you talk about it and take your time with it, the more, the more it grows. So I really appreciate you all amplifying the work that I feel like most needs amplifying. And that, sure, yeah, there's some of my own experience with trauma is now in this space of trying to expand that out to, survivors of sexual assault and outside of me, who I'm meeting along the way, or people who are, who survived intimate partner abuse. And also, making me think about how I survived intimate partner abuse and what story am I going to tell next regarding that. And so thank you, because I'm reminded that that's still needed.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate your voice. And thank you, Claudia, if you're listening, for introducing us.
Shout out to Claudia. You're great.
I'm grateful for you. And yeah, I just appreciate you on a Sunday, especially showing up today.
Thank you. This is great. I really appreciate it. Keep doing the amazing work.
Yeah, and just to second that notion, thank you so much for coming. And a lot of what you said resonated, and I want to chew on more. And I look forward to actually exploring to see some of the stuff you did. And because I know a lot of times even explanations that you're given is not the same as experiencing the actual film. So that's what I look forward to exploring more. And I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to give you some more background about yourself and the thought process behind that, and more of your own history, right? And your family connections. And I always think like we're an extension of our ancestors, and we could take up all the good parts and all the parts about, resistance and healing and moving that forward. It's kind of what we can do as, offspring of our ancestors. And I love what you're doing. And thank you so much for coming here. I appreciate it. We'd like to thank our listeners, and special thanks to Arts in Action, part of USC Visions and Voices, the Arts and Humanities Initiative, for their generous support. Arts in Action, part of USC Visions and Voices, plants seeds for positive social change by activating intensive art projects between community partners, students, and faculty. Today's episode is written and produced by Susie Hess and Yehuda Price. Today's music is co-written and produced by Yehuda Price, utilizing a contraband cell phone while in prison. Our Stories Matter is brought to you by Trauma Informed LA. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram at Our Stories Matter, and our website at traumainformedla.org. Please give us 5 stars on iTunes so more folks can have access and donate to traumainformedla.org so we can keep recording and healing through our storytelling episodes.
Life, it's the life we live. Modern day slavery pursuing cheddar. Life, it's the life we live. Whips and chains trying to duck the 12th letter.
Mamas tell us be good, obey mass. So don't be like daddy, all in the hood, okay, fast. But with their plans.